Chapter 19 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 19. It is a frightful thing when a judgment against an idolized friend first darts into the mind. It is worse when we begin to be so conscious of it that we are in constant terrified expectation of its reappearance, as one is conscious of the grim thing hidden somewhere in the far-off chamber of a dream. But if instead of gliding in to disappear again like some evil vermin, leaving us scared and panting, it come in boldly and take possession of the very heart, then indeed something like desolation has fallen. Do I any longer believe in him? Those were the words which Lucilla kept out of her mind as well as she could. It had been cold in the galleries even. When she turned into the open air it struck her keenly, and the damp and the fog made her shiver. She walked wearily, feeling that with the depression of her spirits all her physical energy had vanished. The climb up the stone staircase to her flat was made by an effort that seemed stupendous, and she thought it was because she was so desperately out of heart that the idea of preparing her evening meal was distasteful. Finally she decided that it was as impossible as a labor of Hercules, and that besides she had no appetite. The room was horribly cold and dark, and she lit the fire at once, crouching down before it to try and get a little warmth into her hands and body. Seated there, she finally forgot about her food and fell into a deep mental struggle. Holding her trembling hands out to the bars, her face looked pinched and wan, and unheeded tears rolled down her cheeks. In the girl's soul was a straight, rigid something which could allow no compromise, not even the capitulation of high wisdom. It was not an ordinary emotion that sickened her spirit, not jealousy, disappointed affection, or selfish fear and regret. Lucilla's tears had not that quality. "Oh, my friend, only be true, only let me believe in you still. I need nothing further." There was hardly a variation of her thought as she sat on the hearth rug trying to keep warm while hours passed over her head. It was all in that key, all in that strain. The belief in Paul was inextricably intertwined with her allegiance to her old party. Should the one be disturbed, the other broke down. He stood for his party in the very essence of his nature, and her rupture with him was her dissent from all. When he left her in the museum she knew that she was cut adrift, but the scission was not to be made without cries and protests of the heart and affections. It was a sacrificial event, a painful act of self-isolation made by a rigid will and a passionately tender nature. Just because it was so hard it had to be, she thought, inexorably final. It happened that Honora, turning over in her large and comfortable mind, after Lucilla had left her, the conversation they had just held together, concluded that the condition which prompted such talk indicated illness. Whereupon the idea of her friend alone in the workman's flat disturbed her, and late in the afternoon she made up her mind to follow and see for herself if attention was required. Thus it happened that towards evening, when it was already dark, Honora stepped out of the station and hailed a Bloomsbury omnibus. Upon arriving at the workman's flat she found the door was ajar. That was a sure sign that Lucilla had returned. Indeed, she heard sounds within. In spite of this, her knock failed to secure attention, so after a moment's hesitation she pushed the door wider and looked in. Yes, Lucilla was there. She was standing in the inner room, holding a hammer in her hand. Her eyes were fixed on the place on the wall where, above the portrait of Sheridan, had formerly hung the crucifix. This now lay in broken pieces on the ground, and as Honora entered unperceived, Lucilla raised her hand and dealt a blow at the portrait. It was vigorously and firmly delivered, so that the glass was instantly shivered into fragments and the picture ruined. There was deliberation rather than passion in her manner, but so absorbed was she that the presence of Honora was still unnoticed. Honora beheld the spectacle of the freshly murdered Christ with a keen illogical sense of desecration and dismay, and of the broken portrait with a more human pang. " Lucilla !" whispered she. Lucilla started and faced her, letting her arms fall to her sides. A flush, followed by pallor, altered her cheek. " Ah !" said she, with her stillest manner, " for work like this I should have locked the door." Honora's eyes, fixed on the shattered crucifix, filled with tears. The early association of her life was strong for the moment, and all her best thoughts of her father mingled with the broken image. " What have you done to the crucifix ?" said she. And then she looked at the shattered picture, and, raising her hand, pointed to that also in enquiry. Lucilla, her hammer still grasped in her slight hand, took a turn or two through the room, after which she came back and faced her friend. " What have I done with that Christ ?" she repeated. " I suppose I am slaying him afresh. He is the personal in us. We have to slay the personal. Now our leaning on him is all personal. We have got to stand alone." She spoke steadily, looking at Honora all the time with a white face and pathetic eyes. Honora was still speechless and stupefied, and had tears under her lids. Lucilla laid the hammer on the table and placed both hands on her friend's shoulders. " Democracy, oh, democracy !" murmured she under her breath. At this Honora roused herself and began to speak with extraordinary energy. " Fudge !" said she, with an impatient stamp of the foot. " I thought Mr. Sheridan stood for democracy, and now you've smashed him up." " Smashed him brutally, Lucilla, breaking his nose and knocking in his clever eyes. As to the crucifix, I hate such work. I've no reason to love the Church. It came between my own father and me. Still, I never see a crucifix but I think of him, and on the whole I'd rather you had levelled your wicked random blows at me than at the Christ." She had broken from her friend and was down on her knees, picking up the fragments and gathering them in her dress, the angry tears rolling the while over her cheeks. When all the portions were collected she carried them to the table. Then she took the portrait and sat down, patiently endeavouring to make the injury it had sustained a degree less ugly and apparent. All the time Lucilla, who had seated herself by the fire, remained passive, with her face rather coldly turned aside. " It is no use," said Honora, wiping her eyes. " I can't mend him. I can't see for tears. I am afraid that he is spoiled for good. I never should have dreamed you could be guilty of an act of frenzy like this." " I don't think that it was frenzy," said Lucilla, quietly. " I was not angry." " It looked uncommonly like it," said Honora, whose eyes and voice alike snapped in her hearty indignation. " Well, I can't mend it, as I say. Neither can I put the crucifix together again. Let me at least cover up the fragments decently." " Put the portrait in the fire," said Lucilla. " Do that yourself. I don't like the man. He is no friend of mine. But I declare I have not the heart to burn him." " Then give it to me." Honora did not move. Lucilla got up, reached her hand quietly to the portrait, sat down again, and held it in the flame until it was consumed. Then she took the frame, deliberately broke it across her knee, and put the pieces on the top of the fire. She sat and watched them burn. Honora drew a deep breath. " I think that a wicked piece of hardness," said she. " Honora," said Lucilla, " don't." " What has Mr. Sheridan done ?"" Nothing. Nothing special. When did you see him last ?"" About an hour ago." "As though," exclaimed Honora, in fresh indignation, " an hour were sufficient interval between impulse and action. For indeed it is action with a vengeance to come and take a hammer to the face of a friend. But it was not impulse. I know what I was about. I am sure of my own meaning." " You never can be sure of anything when you are in a rage." " Honora, I was not in a rage. I repeat that I was not angry. You don't understand." " Oh, I do," said Honora. " I understand better than you do. You call it something grand. I name it mere fury. Mr. Sheridan probably said something detestable. To do you and him justice, he can manage that sort of thing fairly well. And you came home in a rage. And there was the hammer, and there was his face, and you flew at him like a wicked child. That is the whole tale, Lucilla." " Honora !"" Yes ?"" Mr. Sheridan said nothing detestable. It was I who said all the detestable things." " That reflection, then, probably deepened your anger. It makes it clear. Of course, if anger is intolerable, it is just as well to do something to ease it. But you should always keep an eye on the future moment, which you have not done. I mean the inevitable sober moment which will arrive to find the anger gone. It really is a mere point of sanity to remember that emotion is not always boiling over." Lucilla sat still, looking into the fire. " Now, as I believe I told you, I once was very, very angry with a friend. I once found it imperatively necessary to do something rash with Leslie Lyttleton's face. He had infuriated me, and I really could not bear to have it hanging in my room and insulting me. But I did not rush at him with a hammer. Really, Lucilla, what an atrocity! I just slammed it in a drawer and turned the key on it. And there it lay for months. For months, Lucilla." " Did it ?" "Yes, for months. And when I took it back again, you understand that it had quite a friendly air." " There is no point of resemblance," said Lucilla. " I beg you to believe me." " Oh, yes, there is," said Honora. " Human nature is pretty much the same everywhere — even Socialist human nature — particularly quarrels." " Is this a quarrel ?"" A bad one, I suspect." " I am sure, Lucilla, that you will call it by some grand name. That does a great deal of harm. I have not the least doubt that you have treated him badly from a sense of duty. I've no great admiration for Mr. Sheridan, but I like justice to be done, and I'm beginning to fear that there is something ridiculously final about this." " Oh, yes, quite final." " And that is absurd. We've no business to be final unless circumstance compels us. A door can always be left ajar." " A door must be either shut or open." " Fiddlesticks ! That is all nonsense. I suspect you of taking too much upon yourself. Indeed, I am sure." Lucilla said nothing. Her head drooped wearily. Honora gently rose from her seat and came across to her and knelt by her side, taking her into her arms. The two heads nestled together. " Do you know what I am going to do ?" said she, changing her sharp tones to a very soft whisper. " No," returned Lucilla. " What is it ?"" There is a nail left on the wall. The Christ and the portrait hung from it. I am going in a few days to bring you a new picture to hang there." " What picture shall you bring ?"" One of Watts's. His picture of Life and Love. I know where I can buy a copy." " Oh !" said Lucilla, with her breath between her teeth. " There isn't any love." " Yes," said Honora, " there is." Her red lips touched the pale cheek. " There is some here. There always is plenty of love, though perhaps of a humble kind. A picture of that type will be better to hang from the nail on your wall than Sacrifice and Democracy." She uttered the last word with a subtle, careless scorn, as though it were a trifle, an air ball that the prick of a pin could collapse. She laughed a little with her lips close to Lucilla's ear as she said, with gentle derision, "You are too tiny for such grand ideas." Lucilla said nothing. A tear or two slipped from under her lids. "Once," continued Honora, rather timidly, "I thought I could do without my father's love. I considered that he had wronged me, and when I had to leave him I went away with my heart cold. I am beginning to learn. I think it came through our work with the children. I think perhaps you taught me. I am beginning to learn that I cannot do without it, that whether he wronged me or not, I must win his love again." She took Lucilla's hand. "Your hand is very cold," said she, "and now we have come to the end of the lecture. Your cheek is hot. That means that you are ill. Have you had food?" "No, I have not felt hungry." "Well, then, you are going to bed, and I shall prepare you some food. To tell the honest truth, I suspected the worst and brought something dainty in a basket. Now I will help you to undress, and until you are asleep I will stay with you." It was in this way that the bitter day came to an end. It finished up for Lucilla in an unlooked-for sense of consolation. She lay, tired beyond anything that she had guessed, in a room full of light and warmth. The hand of a friend had fed her. Honora's comely form was within her eye, her strong presence near. She sang, too, softly, in a clear, sweet voice. Lucilla had no idea that Honora could sing. Then she chose such pretty melodies, not too bright, but mild and swaying. Surely that was not a Wiegenlied. How strange of Honora! It was very pleasant. It was springtime, twilight, when the shadows are tender. Birds crept to their nests, and so, listening, she fell asleep. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 20. Lucilla never once wavered in the resolution she had taken after Sheridan's election and her interview with him. And for a couple of months at least she had no intercourse either with him or her other friends of his set. Time did not mitigate her view of his attitude. On the contrary, his sagacity and time wisdom took to her eyes increasingly an aspect of treachery to the cause. It was with consuming grief that she thought of him, but never with a hint of return. D'Auverney's position, on the other hand, came nearer suiting the rigid ideal which she had set up as truth. It fitted better the useless, puristic socialism which her mental proclivities led her to adopt, and she had gone over to him and his set, heart and soul, as she believed. And as new converts are apt to do, she made herself particularly active in propaganda work, throwing most unsparing efforts into it. Indeed, she urged her crude dogma of revolt with an unhesitating energy which would have been shocking had not the strength of it been so fine. Sheridan, in spite of his new interests and busy life, did not forget Lucilla. Rumors of her definite adhesion to the Anarchist party had reached him and affected him with genuine sorrow. He never thought of her save with a pang of pity and regret. He was occasionally prompted to write to her, but hesitation so far had baffled the half-formed desire. He could not make up his mind as to the wisdom of approaching her again, even of the right of it. At the same time, he was not able to set the idea completely aside. In Honora's new school, Lucilla performed her duties with exhausting pertinacity. Honora was tempted at times to regret the touch of feverishness she put into her energies. The growing frailty of her form alarmed her, and what, too, had altered her eyes and made them look so strained and harsh? Lucilla met every inquiry as to her health with an air of surprise, but she bent more and more to her friend's devotion, throwing herself pathetically under the shadow of Honora's wise, protective affection, yet never so far yielding to it as to permit it to save her. Honora, even in the girl's softest moments, felt that she touched her over some circle of reticence which nothing could induce her to break down. Meanwhile the affection penetrated more and more into her own nature, and became something singularly persistent and tender, so that she who gave the most drew in reality the signal benefit. One evening in the middle of November, Lucilla, upon entering her flat, saw that the box behind the door contained 2 or 3 letters. The chill habit of living the life of an anchorite alone was one of the matters which Honora in vain had combated. The room never had a welcome for the girl when she entered it. It was always necessary to warm and light it, and to coax out some semblance of comfort by efforts of her own. But Lucilla pressed the sharpness of any deprivation voluntarily to her own heart. It made her think she was simplifying herself, paring away the luxurious habit created by a vicious civilization, and getting nearer to a share in the life of the people. On this occasion she took the letters from the box and threw them on a corner table without looking at them, and then proceeded with the usual business of lighting the fire and preparing her meal. And at last the room was bright and the kettle steaming on the hob. Then she changed her dress, and finally sat down to tea. A touch of austerity in her treatment of herself held her off her letter reading, or was it a prolongation of her pleasure? For to one whose days were thin and meagre and full of aching needs, such communications with the outside world were the deepest satisfaction, the joy of them spreading not only over hours but over days. An envelope containing a few words, even of friendly interest, how much it was! What thrills of life and colour it brought! Not until every trace of her meal was cleared away and the room brightened up for the evening did the girl approach the table on which the real feast was spread. That letter on the top was nothing special. She turned it over. Beneath lay a square greyish coloured envelope, the very look of which was inviting and friendly, thick too, as though a couple of sheets at least might be covered with handwriting conveying news, thoughts, kindness, and perhaps a little rallying laughter. The writing on the envelope was Paul's. When she saw it, her hand darted covetously out and covered it, a snatch of greed in the fingers, her hungry heart leaping as a half-starved thing at sight of a meal. The room was dizzy suddenly with life, with colour, with sound. A pleasant excitement beat in her ears and agitated her breast. To her lone corner of existence, so landlocked, so rock-bound, flowed again the greater tide, drawing in through tiny apertures its salt and tonic wave to refresh the rifts where unregarded mosses be. She raised the packet eagerly, then her fingers suddenly relaxed, and her eyes closed under a frown. She dropped the envelope as quickly as she had gathered it up, and threw both hands over her face, for her will cried out to her, "No, no, no!" A step back was precisely the step that she never would take. It was her resolve to close all avenues that opened from the past, her judgment of Paul Sheridan, the parliamentary member, being unchanged. The tumult into which the sight of his handwriting had thrown her, with its agitating reminder of the happy bygone days, was over as suddenly as it had come. She snatched the letter up a second time, turned towards the fire, and thrust it unopened into the flame. When it was consumed, she gave a sigh of relief, as though she had escaped a danger. 3 weeks went by, and it was now December. The month in its early opening was mild, but the weather prophets foretold the approach of excessive cold. Late one soft and pleasant evening, Lucilla came out of the shabby house in the street beyond Westminster Bridge, after a couple of hours spent in the society of the anarchist companions. The occasion had been an ordinary one, and she was turning homewards without any special emotion either of interest or excitement. D'Auverney was with her. It had grown to be an unspoken custom between them that he should accompany her a part of the way home. She did not care that it should be so, but he was persistent, and in her aching loneliness she suffered his companionship. He was far older than herself. He was, she had reasons to believe, a married man, and his presence gave, on occasion at least, a comforting sense of protection. Usually he amused and interested her with talk. To night he was silent. They had almost crossed the bridge before he spoke. Then he suddenly bent down towards her. Miss Dennison," said he, in a low voice, "I have something important to communicate to you." So fraught with significance was his tone that Lucilla stopped dead on the pavement. "Not here," said he, hastily. "But can you spare me a moment? Will you come with me now, and grant me an interview in some secluded spot?" "Where?" said Lucilla, startled and awed by the immense gravity which he had thrown into his voice. "I know a quiet spot on the Embankment beyond the Houses of Parliament. We can stand there leaning on the wall and looking over into the water. No one will molest us." And d'Auverney, accepting her unspoken consent, took a step in advance and walked on quietly as though leading the way. Lucilla drew her long cloak more tightly about her and followed closely. Her heart began to beat in subdued excitement. The two passed under the shadow of the House of Commons, that place so condemned in the judgment of either, and turned by the railings to the left. The jostling of passengers here sensibly diminished. But in the most thronged part Lucilla had been unconscious of it. She threaded her way amongst her fellows in a singular absorption, her heart fixed on that strange romance which it had accepted in preference to any other, and her senses closed to ordinary sights and sounds. The great pile of Westminster, the bridge and river, the moving procession of the streets, all were tinctured by the same hue, all were beheld through the predominant mystification of anarchism, felt through that, touched through that. No passing face but responded in some way to her exalted entente condition. No trifling event but was in her excited fancy an omen summoning her to proceed. Un voyage de mille lieues commence par un pas, et tous ses compagnons, il n'y a que le premier pas qui écoute. Those were words she had been reading that evening, dully, without inspiration, as it seemed to her now, but they returned to her memory illumined. Passing under the shadow of the House of Lords, her eye flashed its scorn on the bricks and mortar, her tread became firmer, her spirit fiercer. She followed in magnificent assurance, and to the eye of her mind the fate before her trailed a purple and royal robe. D'Auverney led on until they came to a part where the coming and going of men, comparatively speaking, ceased. On one side, a wide road, was a row of pleasant houses; on the other, a wall, and beneath it the noiseless, beautiful flow of the river. "Here," said he, suddenly coming to a halt. Then he leaned against the wall and turned his head to the river. Lucilla approached and stood near him. The tones of their voices could be caught by no one. The immense feeling of grave adventure, of great fate, intoxicated the girl, heart and brain, more deeply than before. "Mademoiselle," said he, in a sudden rough voice, close to her ear, "are you staunch?" "Surely, Monsieur d'Auverney, surely you do not distrust me?" "Ah, would that be possible? No, I do not distrust you. If I had distrusted you, should I have brought you here? I am staunch, Monsieur d'Auverney. But you are so slight a creature, so mignon, petite. Have you strength?" "I am strong," said Lucilla, with conviction. "But these are rough matters, too great, too grave for shoulders so slight and graceful as yours. They are things for men alone." "For women, too, if they touch life. But it is bitter, dangerous. Action is different from talk. It is pleasant to speak of action in the circle of the comrades, to pass the word, to dream. But to come out from them, mademoiselle, with the mind fixed on its lonely intention, to set oneself to do a deed for liberty, for the people. Ah, Monsieur d'Auverney, is it going to be as great as that?" She clasped her hands with a swift, natural movement, and her voice thrilled. "Had you not better go away now, without hearing the rest?" he pursued, in a voice partly mocking, partly tender. "For it is as great as that, as great as that." His dark eyes darted to hers and held them. A soft, subdued shadow made the splendid irises more beautiful. Lucilla's eyes, wide open, clear as stars, stared into them. "Come," said he, still with that deep, dark gaze. "I warn you, you had better not listen." A slow, immense movement of the heart in her breast answered to her prevision that the dream of the last few years of her life was about to be realized. The physical feeling rose upwards to her brain, and there was a rushing sound in her ears. Her own frame seemed far too slight to sustain the idea which had made so sudden an inroad upon her, and now seemed to possess her like some spirit that was not her own. She put out her hand to the wall to steady herself. "Go on," said she, breathlessly. "Come nearer. Turn to the river." Lucilla obeyed. To her wild fancy the whisper close to her ear was coloured crimson and had an edge. "It is not customary to us to confide in others, least of all to entrust our affairs to a woman. Our convictions are our guides. Our acts are not deliberated, they are performed. Only strong souls can go with us." "I know it. But when the occasion comes, when we see that the time is ripe for a far-reaching action, then, if help be needed, we greatly dare, throwing ourselves on our faith in the hearts of the companions. Yes. And now the time is ripe. We have to hasten, mademoiselle, because humanity can wait no longer. We languish for want of a deed, an example. If we are to advance, a leap to the heart of things must be taken. I am weary that we should stand still so long and suffer the people to perish in battalions from the systematized oppression of officialism and greed. We are fainting because of corruption within our own ranks. The Socialists have deserted us. They have moved to the enemy's side and are cozening the people with official lies." Beneath her cloak Lucilla's two hands tightly bound themselves upon her swelling heart. "Even amidst our own immediate comrades there is deviation, fair speech, curtailment. A new departure is necessary. It has been prepared. It is ready. From the moment itself it takes its spring. If we are not to lose sight of ourselves, we must leap forward and plant our ruthless banner of the revolution in the citadel. A deed, mademoiselle, a deed is necessary." "Yes, yes. What?" "Are you then one of us?" "I am. Oh, I am staunch. Do you infer what is coming?" "Scarcely. Go on." "If you saw freedom, a renovated world behind, would you fear the momentary crash, the thunders of falling states?" "No, no. It is what I desire." "Can you bear it? Small, slight thing, can you endure?" "I have told you to proceed." The night was full of the swift dialogue. The air bore it off in reverberations, and the river carried it. "Several great cities are in it: Poissy, Lyons, Lille, Marseilles, Madrid, Paris, of course." "And London?" "Ah!" The ground, the houses, the very air reeled. "London is the heart of the movement. Here is its birthplace. From here the other great centres are moved." Her lips opened, but without sound. "You believe in the strength of the people, their irresistible might, once they are aroused?" "Yes. If I tell you the fates of your comrades, their life, their death, will be in your hands?" Lucilla's eyes closed. God knows what emotion seized the poor little maidenly heart with its dreams, its cold purity, its fire spot of passion, its wild capacity and hunger for self-devotion. "My fate, our fates," added d'Auverney, "they will be safe. But have you still more courage? Can you go a step further? Can you act?" Was it then possible? She was called on to come forward. Her head drooped for a moment. The emotion she was under was almost intolerable. "You require my assistance?" "Yours and no other's." There was deep silence between them. "You are the single woman," he whispered as it was prolonged. Still she did not reply. Gazing across the river, she saw the dim piles of buildings and the lights and the long reflections through a strange luminous mist that hovered before her eyes. A hurried step went by, a hansom dashed past. The noise of the city hovered everywhere, and there were cries from the boats on the water. A strange, cold, mournful sense of finality, of eternal adieu, fell upon her. The earth gladness passed forever from her spirit. Her eyes were moistened for one moment. Suddenly she turned her pure, innocent face, stretched out her snowflake hand, and laid it in that of the foreigner without a word. His eyes leaped. "You give yourself?" "Yes, and I am glad." But her voice was faint. "Can you take a journey suddenly?" Honora, the school, strange incongruities floated into her mind. They seemed as thin apparitions only. The ordinary duty to which she was pledged shrivelled as worthless tinder in a furnace. "Yes," said she. "When must it be?" "This is Sunday. I could make every preparation for Thursday night. It must be Thursday, and not later. I will be ready." "If you require money," he began. She took a step backwards and shook her head. "For the passage, I meant," he said hastily. "Across the Channel, you comprehend." "Monsieur d'Auverney? Not out of England?" "Ah, mademoiselle, not alone. No, no, not alone. With protection and companionship near you." "I do not understand. Where am I going, and what for?" D'Auverney pressed near until his breath was on her cheek. He paused as though to gather force, and then his voice broke from him in a stormy whisper, every syllable of which was tipped with long repressed passion. "What for? Because you are the heart of me, because you fit me as the dagger fits the sheath, because you are my courage, my inspiration, my soul, because I cannot act without you. Without you I cannot bring it through." "I am not understanding," said Lucilla, sharply. She was bewildered, horrified, attracted in one breath. "All this is as it may be. Speak more plainly, for I do not understand." D'Auverney laughed softly. It was a beautiful, musical laugh that seemed to pervade her. Looking at him, his face showed as a splendid thing, luminous with smiles, and with a strange new something that never in her life had she beheld before. Why, in the immense gravity of this moment, did Monsieur d'Auverney smile and look like that? Her delicate lids suddenly shut. In the dim light, the soft, cold virginity that lay about the brows and lips, the high reserve, the cloistral something that set her all apart, seized on the man's heart and fired him to an emotion that was savage in its intensity. That and the inexplicable freedom of her brave English manners, foredoomed to misreading by eyes that had for years perused a voluptuous page in a prim binding, a licentious print, stolen as it were between the rigid boards of a missal. "Is it possible that you have not guessed, that you have not seen that I have chosen you, small, fragile, heroic girl, out of all women, to move with me to the great purpose? Ah, but you have seen, you have known. Can you or I ever forget that evening when you came to me, voluntarily, mademoiselle, unasked, when you condescended to throw yourself upon my society, my tuition, my guidance? Then was it that I first felt the free beat of your exquisite heart near mine, knew that you had broken your bonds and were free, that the long coveted thing was in reach. For do you not see?" He came nearer her. Lucilla raised her hand with a strange movement and brushed it across her eyes, as though some thin, confusing web hung there. The air around her was whirling with whispers and circles of light. "For do you not see," he repeated, "that you are the heart of me? that with you the true inspiration began. In your charming impulsiveness you won me, but I was yours before. You rule me, mademoiselle. I am a child to your slightest touch. I have envied the cloak that enfolded you, the wind that lifted your hair and brought the color to your cheek. Ah, that cheek, that lovely mouth! Monsieur d'Auverney, no, no, do not speak yet. Your mouth was created to be gazed at, worshipped, touched. It is there, mademoiselle, to fill a man's veins with fire and nerve him to his task. Without you I am nothing. With you in my arms I can dare, defy, act. Not I alone, for great cities await your consent. All those threads on which mighty destinies depend converge to a single point that lies in your hand so small, so fine, so delicate, yet so strong. For till you bid me move I will not move. Till you give yourself to me I shall be nothing. Till your lovely mouth surrenders itself I am incapable. My arms ache for you. My nature craves you. See, I give you my heart, my hands, my worship, my all. Good God! Was this the meaning of the moment, this outrage? From that fair height was the descent so swift, so deep? For the first time in her life, in the very moment of her high exaltation of feeling, Lucilla was reduced to the merest sense of sex, condemned to listen to a bare solicitation of a kind hitherto unshaped to her imagining. Stop! The voice struggled as through some physical obstruction. He had thrown himself towards her, and she had retreated a step. Her action, her cry, shook out of him a new storm of words. In the whirl of his whispers and the extremity of her repulsion, it was only by a supreme effort that she kept her balance sufficiently to understand that each sentence of passion was pointed by a hint of some ominously rash adventure to follow upon this stormy scene. But as regards herself, the prose of the situation stole with intolerable clearness upon her cooling fancy. She was in the eyes of this man no maid of France, selected to bear forwards the banner of revolt, but simply an intoxicating draught to his own lips, the froth to his courage, the stimulating bite before action. That was her part, and this the proposition to which the prelude had been played in so sounding a key. Dwindled to such dimensions, she saw herself suddenly from the shameful eyes of another. "Wait!" she cried again. Her voice was thin, weak, inadequate. That immense emotion which had brought her into the situation, and which had lent its elation to her courage even to the point of self-betrayal, was extinguished. Of all the fever and strain, the aspiration and wild expectation and romance, nothing was left. It had burnt out like a coloured fireball, leaving her suddenly cold, small, sane. But once her foot on solid earth again, her keen brain began to trace its way amid the ruin of things, to sort, to test, to determine its own attitude, and to take up its own plan with a cold, mournful realization of the safety of limitation. In a world whose fruition turned to ashes at her disastrous touch, it was still possible to throw oneself back upon the eternal sense of justice, to retreat within the hidden fortress of the spiritual, and entrench one's own petty failure behind that enshrouding greatness. She told herself with sharp, self-flagellating truth that in justice she could not blame this man. He stood for his principle, and no point of his action but was logically derived from it. For the rest, her nearest and main refuge was her English training, the orderliness and just balance of her daily habit. She felt it return to her from the remotest reach of her being, rising up within her, and asserting itself to the utter and complete extinction of all other feeling. The night partook of the change. This was a road she stood upon, those were houses of brick and mortar, that a sluggish, not over clean river, and she once more herself. "I ask you to wait." Her foot stamped imperiously on the pavement. D'Auverney folded his arms and bent his head. "It is well," she said dryly, "to put things of this kind clearly. This is a personal bargain, I perceive. Am I to understand that you are asking me to accompany you on a journey out of England immediately, that I am to go with you on Thursday to Paris? And with my love. You ask me to accompany you. In what capacity? As my well beloved, my most cherished. As your wife, or what? If thus you name it. And what becomes, cried Lucilla with sudden inspiration, of your real wife, of the present Madame d'Auverney? D'Auverney unfolded his arms and looked at her in quiet surprise. What has that to do with the question? Said he. Who told you that I have a wife? I know it, said Lucilla briefly. Just so, he replied calmly. All is clear between us. There was a long silence. No words could have stung deeper, and the venom was that they were true. The situation was to him, not her. As for d'Auverney, he was too versed in conquest to be either impatient or to doubt the issue. He simply waited until she should thrill him again by voluntarily laying her pretty hand in his. The piquant thing about it, from the beginning, had been the impulsive, charming tenders that Lucilla herself had made, those free-taking manners of hers, which, if common to English women, must make courtship indeed a pleasant thing to English gentlemen. He devoured her face and figure with his eyes, and awaited the intense pleasure of her genial compliance. Meanwhile, Lucilla's wit travelled quick ways of its own. The shock was too intense not to prove stimulating, and the swift self-flagellation it brought with it once more steadied her on justice. There was a certain measure of hard, simple sense in d'Auverney's last words, and the heart of pride within her frightful humiliation rooted itself on that. She moistened her dry lips. "If all is clear between you and me," said she slowly, "it is, probably, hardly clear between yourself and your wife." "I trust, mademoiselle," said d'Auverney, quickly, "that you will not permit an affair long dead to prejudice my present suit." Her ears shrank. Was she so cheap a thing as that? The hard, self-flagellating instinct kept her sane and to her point. "Your wife," she repeated, "a woman to whom you gave a pledge." "When I met Madame d'Auverney," said the Frenchman, "I had not met you. Love cannot be bound. You hesitate over a trifle. It does credit to your fineness of heart. There is a legal tie between myself and a woman to whom I am indifferent. I do not recognize the law. My affection being dead, the tie is over. It is nothing." "You mistake," returned Lucilla. "I recognize the tie. In all probability your wife does too." "Mademoiselle," said d'Auverney, speaking with an accent of obvious sincerity, "what is that woman to me that I should consider her? Love that is dead. You cannot revive a corpse. And is your conscience so far legalized that you suppose the law of this matter could be binding on me for 1 second?" Lucilla paused again. There had even been surprise in his tone. She noted it and understood. Again she pressed the point against herself. Justice, hard, cold, salutary, should be meted out. He was simply true to his principles. He was saying nothing but what had been included in his teaching from the beginning. There was not a word that was not logical and writ down in the premise. She had of her own voluntary act, by accepting his dogma, cut from herself all standpoint from which she could logically upbraid, despise, or revile him. The whole thing was astoundingly clear to her mind now, and yet the difference between the coloured obfuscation of yesterday and the intolerable light of this moment was, that then the talk had been general and in the air. Now it was a personal application. "It is not the legal tie of which I think," said Lucilla, in the same thin, quiet voice. "But have you no feeling of doubt when you consider what your wife, your deserted wife, may suffer? No feeling of honour to a pledge given?" "I am not one," he said, with a kind of cold glow in his eyes, "to potter with doubts and mess with honour. Honour! Is your conscience enslaved to such a conventional bit of humbug? I thank my Maker I carry within me no such sickly admonisher. My conscience is my will to preserve myself in life and joy and action." "Monsieur d'Auverney," said Lucilla, "we must end this conversation. There has been some terrible misunderstanding. It is not you I blame, it is myself. My conscience is so bound by that conventional bit of humbug that I am not even able to thank you for your offer." The bitterness of her humiliation escaped her in those words. She turned to go; only, however, to find herself confronted once more by the same storm of passion, by that face luminous with an emotion that offended and sickened her, and by the added sense of fear which a new note of savagery in the man's voice brought with it. "You are not going, mademoiselle," said he, threateningly. "Assuredly we have not explained ourselves. We are comrades, mademoiselle, not children playing at love. You placed your hand in mine. You were under a vow. This is but a prelude to the great event. The vow of secrecy I made I will keep. God help me, I am a weak woman. I have come to a great stress, Monsieur d'Auverney. Your aspect, your manner, terrify and disgust me." That was the horrible part of it. The gentle, courteous companion was transformed to some incalculable mischief, to an unruled, unguided force that flung itself upon her. There he stood before her, an incarnate impulse that acknowledged no law save itself, that was its own God, its own religion. She felt without hearing them his whirling words. They rained upon her as shapeless, inarticulate sounds. She only knew that they stained and broke and defiled her, that an extremity of humiliation was meted out to her, and that all the habitual reticences of her mind and nature, the walled garden and sanctuary of her soul, was trampled down as with the hoofs of some coarse satyr. It was in her mind to shriek for help against this horror always rimmed by his ghastly claim upon her, but when she essayed it, her throat and tongue were powerless. There are words that are brutal as blows, tones that are insults, looks that are indignities, and always that ghastly claim, that hint of her voluntary surrender. She made a rush past him. He laid his hand upon her. His touch was loathsome to her sense as a reptile's. Her heart seemed to swoon within her when she felt it. The repulsion in her feeling was something physically overpowering. She felt herself swaying. There was a great black horror, and the detested, handsome, luminous face following her down into it. The words that escaped her lips in a sobbing moan broke from her unconsciously. "Oh, Paul!" she cried. "Oh, Paul, won't you save me?" "That perjured traitor, that betrayer of the cause, you call to him?" The bitter venom and hate of the tones penetrated to her ear from some far place, and stung her back to life. They seemed to snatch her suddenly out of her careful self-restraint, and throw her into some unknown, unexperienced region of emotion. Her feet, her veins became fire. She did not feel her body. It was gone. She was a single wild force of inspired and supreme fury, a mere piece of hot and instant vengeance. She wrenched herself free. A voice, poignant, ringing, scarcely her own, rushed from her. "It is you who betray!" And darting forwards with a sharp upward spring, and with her fist clenched, she struck, slight small thing that she was, no inconsiderable blow at the detested face. The next moment she was flying with blinding speed in the direction of the safe and noisy turmoil of the streets. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 21. Like a pierced air-ball, Lucilla's illusion had collapsed. All night she lay with wide open eyes and motionless body, while wave after wave of shame and agony passed over her. An excessive wound had been dealt to her sensitiveness. Only when all the written or unspoken social rules that had erected an invisible fortress around her, within which her delicate girlhood had moved and acted, brave and free as a lad is, only when these were destroyed did she realize their existence, and her defenselessness without them, against the brutal tyranny of individualistic lawlessness. Hitherto sex had meant to her simply one of the conditions and modalities of daily existence. She had been scarcely conscious of it. Its meaning was now discovered to her, not through some glorious passion revealing her possession of so sweet and dignified an attribute, but through the cruellest humiliation. Every now and then a sigh of anguish escaped her. She was faint and giddy under the blow. "I am killed," she said. "I am killed. I can never recover it, never look with the same eyes again." And at the same time her judgment repeated that this which had happened had been wrapped in the premise from the first. Beautiful possibility, recondite loveliness, exquisite aspiration might be there too. But then so was this also, this lawless permission of tyrannous outrage by one individual will on another. When morning came after the sleepless darkness, her mind was able to stir a little under its weight of humiliation. The pane of her window, from which the curtain was drawn back, showed a grey bit of sky, from which a mingled shower of sleet and rain fell on the roofs and chimneys. The temperature of the air had sunk suddenly, and it was as piercingly raw and cold this morning as it had been close and warm last night. Lucilla dragged herself out of bed and began her dressing operations. Halfway through them she lit her fire. The growing warmth of the room and her own movements acted as a stimulus, and suddenly her memory took up the thread of last night's event at that constant hint of d'Auverney's of some conspiracy a brewing. And then she recalled the promise of secrecy she had given. Lucilla dropped her brush upon her knee and sat very still, a frown upon her brow. How was she to know that this contemplated action, which she had pictured as a great simultaneous rising of the people in the cities named, was a popular bid for liberty at all, and not a mere individual outrage, such as her sharp lesson of the night before had taught her was possible? Ought she to keep that vow which she had made, or ought she to break it and inform? The doubt and the question were alike frightful and far beyond her present mental capacity to resolve. She threw herself back in her chair and, closing her eyes, tried to find her way out of the shocking trap into which she had stepped. The thought of Paul brought her a momentary hope, which was as instantly erased. It was impossible to write to Paul or any other man. She had lost her bearings in life and could not find the old unconscious freedom of her former attitude. The change was in herself now. Tears of anguish, slow, scarce drops, stole down her cheeks. "I cannot write. I am broken," she whispered. Her next move was to spring from her chair and hurry on her dressing. If she was to keep her sanity, she must escape from these overwhelming thoughts into some cheerful human society. Honora's comfortable presence was the single refuge open to her, and to that she fled. The hour was so extremely early that Lucilla reached the school before her friend had sat down to breakfast. Honora was moving about her bright and cheerful room, opening letters and putting little things to rights, when Lucilla suddenly slipped in at the door. "Why, you strange, quiet, sweet little mouse!" cried Honora, whom instinct led to be lavish of tender epithets to Lucilla. "How did you get here?" "I just came," said Lucilla, fighting for a smile. "Have you had breakfast?" Lucilla started and faintly coloured. "No. When I come to think of it, I haven't. Honestly, I forgot." "H'm," said Honora, stamping her foot. "Let me feel your hands. Down you sit by the fire at once. I'm going to take off your boots. Bit of a thing. You are trembling. Come, nestle up. Was there ever such a piece of arrant foolery? Let me see your eyes." "Not my eyes, Honora, dear. Probably you have been shedding tears over the woes of the East End and starving yourself by way of setting the balance straight. If I could only induce you to leave the world's misery to stronger shoulders than your own, Mr. Sheridan's, for instance, and to stick to your own morsel of duty. Not that I would forbid you to help Mr. Sheridan in a reasonable measure, but do remember you are a woman." "Yes," said Lucilla, in a low voice, "that is the ghastly part of it." "Ghastly? Fiddlesticks! It is one of those facts that has to be looked well in the face and then forgotten." Mr. Sheridan's heart is no doubt a deep and kind one, though I consider him on the whole detestable, and have every reason for supposing he feels the world's misery as much as you do. But men's nerves don't lie on the surface. They carry the burden of life lightly and throw off impressions more easily. The very fact that they don't cry when they are tired, or when anyone speaks roughly to them, marks a permanent difference. When things go cross with them, they play billiards and smoke, and score anyhow. Now we creep away and sob." Honora was stooping on one knee by Lucilla's side. She had Lucilla's foot on the other knee and was unlacing the boot. Lucilla stole a long, covetous look at the bent head with its rippling dark hair. If only she had not repressed her yearning to lay bare to Honora's quizzical eyes and temperate nature her own confused story. But her mind had been too long off the balance to permit her to lay hold of common sense now, and to drop her personal perplexity into the genial stream of indifferent events. "Now there's all this bother about emancipation," continued Honora. "I went in for that once, you know, and of course I'm all for clearing away our disabilities now, including stays and tears if it can be compassed. But the fact is, Lucilla, I discovered the very moment I had found a work that suited me and set to doing it, that I was emancipated. Now you taught me that bit of wisdom. You instructed me in the effectiveness of revolving in one's own circle constantly, instead of taking a meteoric course." "Yes," said Lucilla. "There, the boots are off at last," said Honora, rising. "I don't know how it is, Lucilla, but the sight of you stirs within me the prevision that I am a born mother, a caterer for a tableful of hungry, naughty children, with my mind on jams and consolation. I am glad you are small. It makes it more dignified and fitting that I should kiss you thus, squeeze you in my arms this way, as though you were a child. You are a child, Lucilla. I never saw such inveterate babyhood on any other face, such a singular and inconvenient and abject innocence of contour. Oh, I know everything now." She lifted up her face, with her scared eyes wide open. Again it was on the tip of her tongue to make wise confession. "Do you indeed? Everything, I should imagine. Bonny face, exquisite little mortal. I feel something between a clumsy giantess and a wise matriarch beside you. I don't know what that word means, and believe I invented it. Otherwise it is historical, perhaps. Leslie says I am weak in history. What I mean by it is the feel, don't you know, at the bottom of your heart, every time you realize the helplessness of a grown man to achieve his own salvation. In details, a sort of excruciated pity that so cumbrous an animal should be so constantly inadequate. I believe we knew we were mothers before men knew they were men. It's that which makes it inevitable that we should love them. Well, I have very much the same sort of feeling towards you and your superior character and intellect." Honora was moving about now and looking after the breakfast. "Coffee shall it be, Lucilla? I mean to make it myself. Also hot toast, muffins, and more substantial viands arrived from below. Thin little hand, I believe you are one of those women who expect to obtain greater refinement and clearness of thought by the simple process of starvation. If women would but realize that nourishing food is the basis of right thinking, I believe they would rescue themselves from absurdity. Am I absurd, Honora? Chronically so, my sweetest Lucilla." "Honora, yes. Is it my turn to take the English citizen class this week?" "Certainly it is, my clever mite. Have you anything ready?" "I thought I would speak to them upon the generalizing faculty. Have you observed a curious thing about women?" "Only too many, my dear. But we are in a conspiracy to paint the sex as perfection, and to reserve our reviling for individual members. I have no one to revile saving myself. I am sad, Honora. I want to tell the children, through some simple lesson, that women have two chief things to conquer in life. One is the brain inertia that prevents them from ever making a generalization at all. The other is the want of control, of staying power, that impels them, if ever they do achieve a generalization, to fling themselves headlong after it into some precipitate and fatal action." Honora's gaiety of manner concealed some very serious anxiety on Lucilla's account. She persuaded her friend to remain with her for the 4 following nights. Longer than that Lucilla would not assent to. Then Honora extracted a promise that before she went back to her flat she would send the key to a neighbour, and at least have the room prepared and warmed for her return. Lucilla consented. Friday morning, which was to see her termination of the week's school work, stood out to her imagination, shrouded in vague surmise. D'Auverney would have reached Paris by then. A cloud of dismay and anxiety hung over her mind. She would rather get back to her flat and meet the event alone. Meanwhile, she concealed her feeling of illness and mental disturbance as well as she could from her friend, and combated nervous attacks of terror by assiduous application to work. Honora took in a morning paper, but rarely herself perused it. The sight of it on the table at breakfast would steal from Lucilla the possibility of swallowing her food, and after breakfast she opened it with dread. Friday morning arrived. "Here's the paper," said Honora, pushing it towards her. "I never have time to read it. The government will, I daresay, look after the country if I look after my school." Lucilla opened it. There seemed nothing special in the foreign intelligence upon which her eye had instantly pounced. She was turning the other pages listlessly when her attention was caught by a heading that instantly riveted it. The evening before, that is, on the Thursday, Sheridan, in company with Lyttleton, had attended in the public gallery a sitting of the school board. It was dark when they came out, and first crossing to the river side of the embankment, they turned their faces in the direction of Westminster. Both of them noticed that under the arch near the offices of the Thames Conservancy the figure of a man was leaning. Neither of them remarked, seeing they were walking in an opposite direction, that he moved from his position as they approached, and crossing the road in the direction from which they came, kept pace with them upon the other side. If they had happened to observe these movements, neither would have attached meaning or importance to them. They walked along in the negligent security habitual to persons who belong to a, comparatively speaking, well-ordered city. It had been snowing for a couple of days, but for the moment the sky was clear and beautiful above the white-clad trees and houses. They chose the riverside because of the quiet beauty of the scene, and continued their walk along the embankment for the same reason. The cold of the atmosphere was sensibly diminishing, and a thaw was imminent. At present, however, it was calm and beautiful enough to tempt them to stop and stand by the wall and look over the river, and draw once more to their citizen hearts the never-wearying feel of the great city as the Thames and its embankments carry it. Sheridan, in particular, was saturated with the emotion of London. In the daytime this emotion was done into the prose of his continuous labours for the city of his birth and love. In the evening, in rare moments, at such an hour as this, when she hung her lights above and around the river, and shrouded her pinnacles and towers in a mystery and beauty that was something over and above their own, in such a moment it affected him from that region of ideality and poetry which were strongly hidden in his imagination, but which left a mark conspicuously in his eyes and on his brows. It escaped him now in a sense of the vastness and quietness of this central scene of a city not yet asleep beneath the night, and then of the vastness and quietness of unseen things above and beyond the turmoil of our best endeavour, of the grand indifferent persistence that draws us on when we ourselves think that we are pulling. A sigh escaped him. "I must hold to my own," thought he, as he felt that greater reach upon him, "to that little which I am able to see." There had run through the dim places of his imagination a faint shudder, a whisper of doubt. It was not superstition. It was the profound surmise of a strong intellect that the arrayed forces contain an incalculable remainder, the tribute of a powerful mind to its own fallibility, and of a splendid will to the small quiet something which is mightier than itself. In such moments the character of Sheridan's face changed. It became the face of a virile man, subduing himself to the strong correction of that impenetrable greatness which warns us of the subordination and smallness of ourselves. "It will all be spoiled to-morrow," said Lyttleton, looking round him after the silence, "but it is perfect to-night." The two walked on, the dogging figure unobserved upon the other side, until Westminster Bridge was reached. Here they crossed again and struck northwards. "Let us go by Parliament Street and the Park," said Sheridan. "There is plenty of time, and it will be quieter." Their destination was Spring Gardens. Sheridan had an appointment at the offices of the County Council, and was proposing afterwards to spend the evening in the society of an ex-cabinet minister who wished to take his opinion upon a subject of which he was known to have a deeper acquaintance and more originality of thought than most men. As they walked on, Sheridan suddenly took back a joyous militant bearing and broke out into his habitual raillery at the Liberal party. "I'm sick at them," said he. "They haven't it in them, so far as I can make out, to muster a programme. They are looking about for an election cry in the stars, with this misery-infested city lying at their feet. In effect, they acknowledge that they can't think of anything to come before the country with save Home Rule, Welsh disestablishment, and liquor. One would think we had cleared everything up, and were forced into imbecility for want of a job. Hardhead asked me to call to-night and have a talk on the rates question. I'm willing enough, but I mean to put in a word or two about the programme by the way. They've got to accept mine if they can't think of one of their own. But what are we to make of a set of men who stand for office and have to seek for their working ideas outside, anywhere where there's a brain furnished enough to look about it? I'm sick at the thing. First they grope about for a programme, then when someone outside has sketched one which has a little more to do with the interests of the majority of the voters than the behaviour of the moon, and when they've got elected into power on a genuine cry, payment of members, and things of the kind which touch the heart of the question, then to a dead certainty they'll drop it. On they'll go pottering at something off the mark, instead of promptly setting right half a dozen abuses that lie at the root of London's misery, and which it is their privilege to be able to remedy from the different departments by so many strokes of the pen, without applying to Parliament at all." They had turned into Parliament Street and were nearing the Park. Here it was lonely and still. No one was in the street that they could see, save that moving figure on the other side of the road. Just then the man crossed over a little before them. In the heat of conversation they hardly noticed him. Sheridan was on the inside of the path. They were close on the man's heels now. Suddenly he turned round, and made as though he had changed his mind, and was in a violent hurry to return. He pushed rudely against Sheridan, and in that moment the latter felt Lyttleton throw the whole of his weight violently upon him, so as to propel him to the right. In the same instant a stinging, burning pain in his left side forced from him a sharp scream, and he stumbled forwards, fainting, on to the snow. "My God!" cried Lyttleton. "I saw the knife in the man's hand. After him, some of you fellows." He ran towards the Park, a big man with a bushy beard. The road had appeared to be empty. It was full now of hurrying people. Lyttleton was on his knees in the snow by Paul's side, and was gently endeavouring to turn him over. Someone lent him a hand. The sight sickened him. The knife was still in the wound. Round the blade near the haft was a piece of paper with an inscription upon it, rendered illegible by the flow of blood. "I don't think he's badly hurt," said a quiet voice near him. "I'm not a doctor, but I know a little of these matters. I'll help you to lift him." The blow fell short of the mark somehow, but it was a near squeak too. "I saw the man," reiterated Lyttleton, "and I saw him raise the knife. There wasn't time to do anything but throw my friend forwards. Just so you saved him, or so I believe." The next few hours were a nightmare of misery to Lyttleton. In addition to the uncertainty about his friend, was the sordid horror of the police inquiry. Lyttleton could throw no light upon the matter. He could only repeat the story of the man's sudden movement to return, of Sheridan's absorption in his talk, of the extraordinary swiftness of the blow, and of his own impulse to divert the stroke from a vital part by thrusting his friend to the side. With the man himself he had no acquaintance. He was a complete stranger, dark and wearing a bushy beard. To the motive of the deed he was absolutely without a clue. It was not until Saturday evening that Lyttleton was admitted to Paul's sick room. The verdict of the doctors had been, however, favourable from the first. The wound, though painful, was not dangerous, the shock being probably the worst part of the matter. That was the reason of their keeping the patient in strict seclusion. The assault had taken place on Thursday night. On the Saturday morning Sheridan was sufficiently recovered to be able to reply to a few inquiries of the police, who were still vainly searching for the assassin. On the Saturday evening, at his urgent request, Lyttleton was admitted to his room. Lyttleton found him lying in bed, white from loss of blood, and weak, though in no kind of danger. "Are you pretty comfortable, old fellow?" asked he, tenderly. "Pretty fair. It bites a bit, of course, but I don't know exactly why I'm lying here, except that the doctors will have it so. I'm forbidden to talk or to read or to think, I believe, for the present. I'm to do nothing but lie and heal up. It won't be long." "So they tell me. It's a mere trifle. Just a little patience required, I expect. They'll let me come in and sit with you now and then, I fancy." "Yes, thanks. Did you see that paper?" "What paper?" Lyttleton looked a little startled. the paper through which the knife was thrust. The police called for evidence about it this morning. I had to see them. Well, you see, they have deciphered it. They showed it to me. The inscription was, 'To the traitor.' Lyttleton, to whom have I been a traitor? Lord knows, old fellow, I don't. Nor, I expect, does any one who is in full possession of his senses." A slight smile hovered over Sheridan's lips. "Well," he said, "my own opinion is that our friend is an uncommonly acute fellow, and knew particularly well what he was about. They have no bigger foe than I am in England. The Chief Commissioner of Police," he added, still with half-veiled amusement, "is not in it with me." "You have a clue, then, Sheridan?" "You see," pursued the latter, calmly, "when a fellow sticks a knife into you, you naturally look up to inquire before going under. I did so, and I saw the man's eyes plainly above the false beard." "And recognized him?" "I don't know if I must say as much as that. He was safe out of England, you may be certain, before I was well enough to be questioned." Lyttleton considered a little. "And will never come back again, I believe," said he, after a pause. "I think I follow you now. But he is caught on another count. It appears he went to Paris. He went there on business of a sort, and he was prompt at it, too. The Chamber of Deputies, or something on a great scale, is supposed to have been his object. Unfortunately, what he carried about him had to be disposed of hastily before the time, or he lost his nerve, or something went wrong, and he threw his bomb too soon." "Any one hurt?" "A nursemaid carrying a baby. So much of the bourgeoisie as may have been comprehended in a single infant in arms has, I am afraid, perished. A few windows have been broken in addition, and the police caught their man." "I am sorry to hear this. Poor d'Auverney." The man did not understand the meaning of the idea at the back of his own mind. That was why it wrecked him. "I believe I can follow it better than he did. I believe I see the reach of it ever so much clearer than he. I have never denied the fineness in it. The idea of the anarchist is a right sort of leaven. It is when it gets into the wrong hands that it becomes damnable and absurd. I hate to hear of a man experiencing defeat like this. D'Auverney was sincere enough in all conscience. And besides, when he struck at me, he showed himself sagacious. I can forgive a man much on that count. I stand as the biggest foe of anarchism in England, because I understand it. D'Auverney is perspicacious, at least. A lesser man would have struck at the Home Secretary or Chief Commissioner of Police." Paul lay silent for a moment. Then he added in a gentle voice, "I think you and I need not add our little bit of information to the sum of things against the poor fellow. Honestly, I had not put two and two together when the police called this morning. We'll just lie low, shall we? And so the thing was in today's paper." "Just so." Paul lay silent. Presently he turned his head wearily to the wall. It was the only movement permitted him at present. Lyttleton was excruciated to detect the signs of agitation in his face. He touched his hand kindly. "I won't stay now," said he, tenderly. "You'd better be quiet. When you've picked up a little more, I'll come and act as amanuensis and that kind of thing." Paul suddenly opened his eyes. "I have a message to send," said he. "It isn't at all urgent, but I should like to give it while I remember." "All right. What is it?" "When shall you call at Miss Kemball's?" "To-morrow, probably. I usually go there on Sundays. Can I do anything for you?" "If you should see Lucilla." "Lucilla is not there on Sunday. She would be on Monday if I went then." "Monday will do. If you should see her, tell her, from me, that I'm all right, scarcely hurt a bit. Say that it is a trifle, and that I shall soon be well and about again." "Very well. I shall not forget. I will call at the school on Monday." "Thanks. That will do. Is it a cold night?" "Horrible. All yesterday it thawed, and to-day is a black and miserable frost." CHAPTER 21. Chapter 22 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 22. On the Friday afternoon of the day on which an account of the assault on Sheridan had appeared in the paper, Lucilla returned to her flat. All morning, by a stupendous active will, she had attended to her duties and retained a show of composure, her hope being that by so doing she might escape Honora's tender vigilance, and get back unquestioned to the lonely place where she could best fight her agonizing thoughts. And so well had she succeeded in her efforts that even Honora was deceived, and permitted her departure for the week end with rather less anxiety and reluctance than was usual. It was shocking weather. A thaw had set in after 3 days' snow, and it was accompanied by rain and every raw chill evil of the atmosphere. Lucilla, whose feeling of exhaustion in both mind and body had been steadily increasing, was drenched before she reached her destination. Her cloak and skirts were dripping and her feet wet. As she painfully toiled up the stairs to her flat, a woman to whom, on Honora's insistence, she had confided the office of preparing and warming her room, came out and returned her the key, and inquired if any further services were needed. Lucilla, her mind preoccupied by her supreme need to conceal her misery, shook herself into an ordinary manner, summoned a smile to her face, and, forgetful that her flat was entirely unfurnished with food, paid the woman off on the spot, and assured her that she should require no further attention for days to come. Then she continued her slow progress to the topmost story in the building, and, having entered her rooms, closed and locked the door behind her. A fire blazed on the hearth. The girl had scarcely force left to unhook her cloak and let it fall from her shoulders. That accomplished, she dropped wearily to the floor, leaning her head back against the wall in an attitude of complete exhaustion. She was deadly white, her eyes were closed, her features drawn, and her hands, palms upwards, lay listlessly by her side. Effort was, indeed, finally extinguished in that of passive suffering. She was as incapable of thinking as of movement. Wave after wave of formless misery passed over her. She knew what had happened without being able to set the event in a single articulated phrase. How long she lay in this condition of collapse she did not know. When she came to something like consciousness again, she found that the fire was a dim glow in the grate, and that dusk was gathering. Her feet and limbs were cold and numb, and a feeling of deadly weakness almost precluded the idea of freeing herself from the wet boots and skirts that still encumbered her. As to her misery, all she recalled of it was that thinking had proved a task beyond her, that for hours she must have lain there without making 1 inch of progress in the solution of some sickening mental problem. A dim, urgent feeling that the problem was still there was effectual to arouse her. She dragged herself to her feet and noted with a faint sense of surprise that her body was full of severe pain. The sharpness of it made it a stupendous effort to get across the room and to place more fuel on the fire and rekindle it to a blaze, but the extreme cold she experienced compelled her at least to this endeavour. The kettle was, she believed, full of water, but then she remembered there was no food in the flat, and that she had forbidden the woman to call and look after her, and that finally she had locked herself in. The question of food did not, however, disturb her, for the very idea of it was nauseating. She lit a couple of candles and then painfully freed herself from her wet garments. Sinking down in a low chair after the effort, she thrust her bare feet to the blaze and tried in this way to bring back feeling into them. By and by the greater degree of physical comfort sent the frozen blood a little quicker through her veins, and into the confused, miserable mental blackness a clear thought penetrated. "Ah!" she said, "it is Paul who is hurt, Paul who was trying to do his duty to men. It is Paul I am thinking about. That is what this weight on my brain means. There is something I have to say to him." She rose from her seat and reached her blotting case and a pencil from the bureau, but no sooner had she sunk back on the chair than the blankness seemed to return to her mind. She held the pencil suspended, but found herself unable to trace a word. She recalled what her intention had been, but there was scarcely anything beyond that. Then she got up again, placed the paper and pencil on a little stand by the side of the bed, and the 2 candles with it. After that she piled more fuel on the fire, and then, panting for breath, fighting for each new effort, weeping from sheer pain, she finished her undressing. "If I can only get into bed," she thought, "and lie still and get warm, my mind will come back to me. There is something about Paul, something that I have to remember and say to him." At last the agonizing efforts were over, and she was lying down in the warm light of fire and candle, only, however, to sink again to the condition of semi-collapse. It may be that eventually she slept. At least she passed into a land of nightmare and distracting visions. From this, in the early hours of the morning, she waked in indescribable misery. Not only was the weight on her spirits, the sense of intolerable and crushing anguish, heavier than before, but her head and limbs were tortured with increased pain. Whereupon she knew that she was ill here in the workman's flat on a Saturday morning, and with every chance of assistance carefully excluded by her own hand. "At least I shall be undisturbed," said she. Her lips were parched and body cold. The fire and the candles had long burnt out, and though the means of rekindling both and of procuring water for herself lay to her hand, it was impossible even to raise her head from the pillow. She fell again into a troubled, half delirious doze, which was all mingled with the confused misery of the day before. That misery touched Paul. It was intimately connected with the idea of him. But then what was it? Every thought reached and strove after him, and failed always at the solution, as though a hand wiped it from her brain. "Oh, my friend," was all her moaning thought, and nothing further. After that came a deep sleep, and with it an appalling dream. It was not earth any longer, but some spiritual region where judgment reigned, and Paul was there. She dreamed that he was an apostate, and that he was condemned by the spirits of the just. She dreamed that it was she herself who pointed the first finger of accusation at him. And in her dream she thought that by the act she won high heaven for herself, and that heaven thus won was more horrible than the lowest hell. The horror waked her. She found the daylight in her room, and knew that it must be far into Saturday morning. The weather had cleared, and it promised to be bright, but the light hurt her, and the things on which her eyes rested were terrible, though she recognized in them the ordinary furniture of her chamber, and strove to reason herself into tranquillity. One object seriously alarmed and perplexed her. Beyond her, somewhere between the bed and the wall, rising from and surrounded by a nebulous mist, she saw the profile of Sheridan. It was clear and distinct in outline and coloring, but was cold and enigmatical as a sphinx. It had been less terrible if it had turned and looked at her, but it gazed immovably at vacancy. This strange illusion terrified her spirit, and she turned her head on the pillow and closed her lids. "My brain is disordered," she thought. "This is illness, no more. If I shut my eyes for a long time, what I see will vanish." She kept them closed, while her heart thumped and tumbled in her breast. Then, after an intolerable interval, she opened them timidly and anxiously. The profile was still there. Her alarm and uneasiness acted as a stimulus to her brain. She remembered the intended letter, and her own extreme anxiety to write it. By a supreme effort she got her hand out of bed, stretched it to the stand by her side, and secured both paper and pencil. Then, knowing nothing clearly of the subject of her proposed missive, she traced slowly and painfully the words, "Dear Paul, forgive." There were other ineffectual tracings, but the paper and the pencil dropped from her hands, and even the memory of her confused intention was effaced. Her thought wandered to Honora. What would she not have given to have heard her step upon the stair, to have seen her strong, kind face at the door, the brown eyes full of love? What would she not have given to be touched by her hands? Her mind dwelt upon the memory of Honora until the contrast heightened the present desolation to too intolerable an anguish, and she sought refuge from it in the more familiar grief and discomfort. She had been lying with her head averted. She turned it and sought again timidly for the strange illusion which embodied, as she knew, some tremendous but inexplicable grief. It was still there, immovable, and in the same posture. Her eyes rested on it in something between terror and satisfaction, for at least the features were those of a friend. All day it went on thus. Once she seemed to herself to swoon into a great darkness, from which she was snatched back by a voice that cried loudly in her ears, "One of you shall betray me." She woke up, her heart beating suffocatingly, and could see no trace of any living thing. The long, terrible, lonely hours went on and on. No one came save once the milkman. His loud knock and cry shook her out of a doze. She had an agonizing desire for a draught of milk, and strove to call to him, but even had she been able to make her voice loud enough to reach him, he was whistling and rattling his cans, and she had no chance. His retreating foot was the next thing she heard, and the milk he had left behind the door was as much out of her reach as though he had never brought it. At that, for a moment, she cried helplessly. Then she recalled how this which had happened to her was an accident. She was not really forsaken, not absolutely destitute, as those are who have not the love to turn to, even had they the power. The thought of Honora came back once more with supreme consolation. It was no longer a pain, it was a help to think of her. Thus and thus it would have been could Honora have known of her suffering. And then she thought of Paul, the friend whose calmer but unvaried kindness had covered years of her life. An immediate and sudden realization of what had happened followed upon that. The renewed shock might have extinguished the little flutter of living activity that had returned to her brain, save that the thought of his kindness, his utter incapacity for malice or for harbored resentment, was uppermost in her mind. And then a cry for forgiveness trembled from her lips, and in her fancy her cry was met and covered by an instant and warm assurance of pardon. It must be so, for such was the nature of Paul. She thought how the threshold of this door of desolate suffering had been trodden by human feet before, and that the way had been sharper to the steps. She was not alone. That supported her. To her the thought of sharing anything human, however bitter, could bring majestic tranquillity. An austere consolation descended upon her breast and brought it peace. After that, the sound of her own voice, the conviction of having uttered incoherent words, startled her. She concluded that she was getting worse, and that her brain was more disordered, and that all power and self-control might leave her. The cold she suffered and the parching dryness were something inconceivable, and pain held her as in a vice. She knew now that, following upon days of exhaustion, over-excitement, and weakness, she was stricken with the prevailing plague of influenza. Nothing else could account for the fever, the shivering, and the extreme weakness. She calculated that, Sunday intervening, Honora would not miss her from the school until the day following, but she was convinced that on her non-appearance on Monday morning her friend would surmise that something was wrong, and would come to inquire. Monday afternoon, when school was over, was then the earliest that relief could reach her. How near was she to that? In her fever she had lost count of time. Time and eternity were one. And then she remembered that Honora might not be disturbed by her non-appearance at first. She might not send. She might wait to hear something. That last clear thought was again too much for her weakened brain. At the point she fell into delirium, and the chilly silence was disturbed by rapid, incoherent talk of which she herself was unaware. This was followed by a season of quietude and blank unconsciousness. Hours passed, and she lay absolutely motionless. From this condition she waked at last. The room was still as a vault and as black. She herself was a little blot of feeling in the midst of an appalling darkness. At first she thought it was night, and then she dimly surmised that the silence and the darkness were in herself. By a tremendous effort she raised her lids to ascertain. It made no difference. "Now," said she, with a deep thrill, "this is death. I feel more than I have ever felt before, but I am blind and deaf. Soon the feeling will go too." Death! That appeared to signify the intensest expectation. The loud laboured thumping of her heart — it seemed to tumble loosely in her breast — was rather a sensation than a sound. It was the only pain she felt. The thing seemed leaping with an agonizing fear which she herself did not share. For amidst that physical convulsion her thoughts were tranquil and clear. She was certain of death's approach, and she reflected that in this life all her precious things, her most delicate and refined things, the heart's core of her ruthless truth, had been rejected, misunderstood. She thought of it tearlessly. Yet no martyr in a Russian prison suffered more. She was tearless because she recognized in it a certain fitness, a certain inevitableness, even a commonness of experience. "I shall die," she said, "and it is best for me to go. God knows I was sincere, but I did not understand the time, nor the time me. Some of the things I thought I still believe. My tremendous error was to dream that truth is single. I am a woman whose mind was pitched out of its own era. It is well to die now. If I had lived, I should have been ground to powder." It came to her with compelling clearness as she lay there with her face sharpening, thinning, paling, and sinking into the pillow. Her brave, clear faith and ennobling tenderness had squandered themselves upon the impossible. Mercy itself could not have saved her, except by death only. She did not belong to her age. Meanwhile the coldness gathered. It was different from the cold of the fever. This was still and deadly. Even that sensation was extinguished at last, and the thumping of the heart grew less and less. She thought she was falling somewhere. The bright sunshine of Monday noonday poured into the room in vain for her darkened eyes. It illumined the neglected, dust-covered furniture and the dead ashes in the grate, and lay upon the little white bed across the corpse-like figure with its sinking outline and the sharp face whose only sign of life were the little puffs of laboured breath that escaped at longer and longer intervals from the parted lips. To the last her thought was occupied with Paul. The hateful atrocity from which he had suffered had returned to her memory, the atrocity in which she felt herself cruelly involved. With a certain tranquil majesty, as in the eye of death, she laid aside the human anxiety for spoken forgiveness, and threw herself upon a solemn trust in the slow, true judgment of time, in the great and softening influence of distance, to bring gently to his mind a better discernment of her nature and motives than her acts had left him now. "Why," thought she, "bemoan the fact that death stayed my hand and stole my speech? Great hearts discern the hearts of others. I will trust this, even this darkness and silence. Speech would seem sweet, but I cannot reach him. He will never know that I struck the mouth that reviled him. I shall be a shadow in his thought, but only for a time. I will trust to the greatness of his heart now, as I did not before. My best friend, you to whom I owe my best, why was my life poisoned by that bitter doubt of you? The bitter sweetness of this unspoken trust is only left me now." She lay, still as death, small, white, broken, but the voiceless cry in its intensity might have vanquished space and penetrated to the ear of her friend. Meanwhile Honora, startled at her absence, and still more by Lyttleton's arrival and news, was hurrying on her way to the flat in his company, her heart laden by an apprehension which had stirred it all too late. It was a little after midday on Monday that Lucilla's eyes opened once more, in the conviction that the room was light again. It appeared to her a subdued, imperfect light, out of which the bookshelves and the old bureau curiously and familiarly loomed. She longed for the power to turn her eyes to the window and catch a glimpse of the blue sky, or even of the London grey again, but such a movement was beyond her. Her eyes had fixed themselves on the door which stood opposite. Would it not open at last? Surely it would open. Why else should she gaze there with such certain expectation? And now surely, surely it had moved forwards. There was a mist which prevented her from knowing certainly. The darkness had returned. But how otherwise could it be that everything was changing, that the sense of a presence near her was so strong? Assuredly that was a human hand laid upon hers. Ah! The very weariness and weakness were passing away. Perhaps it had been a dream. The weight and misery melted from her brain. A deep peace crept over her heart. She was quite well now. She was coming back to life. The nightmare of months was over and gone. She remembered that her shoes lay near her bedside. It would be easy to stretch her hand and get them. She would put them on and run down the stairs and herself carry her own message to Paul's door. And in such a moment the girl's broken spirit floated away. Chapter 23